Hello everyone and welcome back to our new orchard workshop. In this section we'll be talking about where to purchase your new trees and how you should be planting them for best success. My name's Katie. I am the program manager for Unity Gardens Orchard Program, and this series is made possible through the Community Urban Forestry Department of Indiana's Department of Natural Resources, and is also in partnership with the Giving Grove, an orchard network across the country. So first up, we will be talking about where to purchase your trees for the best tree stock. So when you're looking into planting trees, you'll find that they come in three options usually, and that's bare root, containerized, and balled and burlapped. So we're going to go through each of these so you know what you're getting. So bare root's the first option. This is my favorite way of getting fruit trees. And it's exactly what it sounds like. The tree is going to come completely bare root. There's going to be no dirt on it. And the reason I like this is that you can see the full root structure. So any issues in that root structure, if you have circling roots, if you're not sure how big of a hole you need to dig, you can tell that immediately with a bare root tree. It's also way cheaper because it's much lighter. They're not shipping along all that dirt with the tree. And you don't have to worry about transferring invasives in the soil. So especially right now, we're worried about Asian jumping worm that is being transported in soil in nursery sales across state lines. And if you get a bare root tree, you don't need to worry about that or any other invasives that might travel in the soil. And they are much lighter, so they are easier to handle than carrying around a bunch of containerized fruit trees. The con side of it is that they need to be planted almost immediately, or they need to be protected until they're planted. So if you are not planting your bare root trees immediately, what you can do is this method called heeling in that you see in this picture here. You can see that the person is just covering the roots with soil to keep them damp so that they don't dry out and the tree doesn't die before you get a chance to plant it. Your best bet is always going to be planting as soon as you can. And you are getting these trees in dormancy, and once you start seeing green tips on the stems, then you really need to get them in the ground. The downside of doing bare root is usually they're only available in the spring planting season, but I've been finding that the varieties you like, you need to order early anyway, so probably spring planting season makes sense, and you won't be able to get very old trees. But if you are planting older trees, there's usually a larger transplant shock. So usually the young trees you plant catch up with the older trees anyway. So like I said, when you get a bare root tree, you can see that full root system. So you can spread out the roots as you go to plant, and you want to make sure that they're all spread out so that they're going to different parts of the ground. And make sure you don't bury the graft region or the root flare. We'll talk more about that when we get to the planting section. And you can soak the tree for an hour before planting. If you're really into it, you can add liquid fish, which is an organic fertilizer, just to give your tree a boost before you move it into its new home. So containerized is the second option that you'll run into, and essentially what that means is you're getting a potted fruit tree. You can plant it whenever you're ready because it's in soil, so those roots won't dry out. That does usually open you up to fall planting time. But again, if you're ordering in the fall, you're going to have to be a lot more flexible with what's available, unless you're ordering from somewhere that's really expensive. I don't love containerized fruit trees because you'll often run into issues with the root system. This is a really, really aggressive example here. This is not typical, this level of root bound. But if you've ever had a houseplant that you've left in the same pot for like 5 years, and then you take it out of the pot eventually and all the roots have circled around because they have nowhere else to go, that's not uncommon in containerized fruit trees. So that may be an issue you run into. You can pull those roots apart really carefully at planting time. You can prune any roots that are going in the wrong direction, but it is something you have to pay attention to. And because you're shipping all that dirt with the tree, it's usually going to be more expensive to ship, and you should be checking to see if there are any insects in that dirt that shouldn't be, just to make sure that we're not bringing invasives into our ecosystem. So here's a picture of what you're more likely to see with a root-bound containerized fruit tree. You can see that all of these roots have just circled around, and if you put that straight in the ground like that, it'll take them a long time, if they do, break apart from that circle to start seeking nutrients in the ground. And what that means is that they won't have any nutrients available to them. They'll only have water from a really small location, so that really doesn't set them up for success. Or even worse, you may have this problem where you have a root going across the stem of the tree or just growing like back on the tree. What this does, it may not look like an issue now, but as that root gets bigger, it'll start choking your tree. So if you have something like that where the root's going in the complete wrong direction, you need to prune it out if you get a containerized tree. So balled and burlapped is pretty uncommon for fruit trees. You'll see this as an option usually with landscaping trees or native trees. People like it because it means you can plant much older trees. You get your shade canopy, you get that full tree much earlier. But the way that balled and burlapped works is that they plant trees in the nursery, and then this big machine comes and it just cuts into the soil and scoops the tree out and puts this burlap canvas over it for transport. But when they scoop the tree out, they're usually chopping off a bunch of roots that the tree had put out. So it causes a lot of transplant shock. And what we've found is that if you're getting a balled and burlap tree that's maybe 7 years old, if you planted a tree that was 3 years old, that was just containerized or bare root, because it went through less transplant shock, it'll usually catch up to that balled and burlap tree. The other thing is that these are expensive because they need a lot of machinery. It is very hard to carry a tree that is that old, that has a bunch of weight to it. So it's also not really applicable for the backyard planter. So a lot of people also ask where they should get their fruit trees from. My rule of thumb is if they are also selling toilets there, you probably shouldn't get a fruit tree from this place. So any of your big box stores are maybe not where you want to go. You should really get from someone who's just selling fruit trees. Another weird rule of thumb I found is if the website is really, really old and kind of out of date, they probably do wonderful work. So like Grimo Nut Nursery, for example, it's up in Canada, and they just specialize in like hazelnuts and walnuts and other nut trees. And they have some descriptions on their cultivars and things like, oh, we've only been growing this tree for 15 years, so we're not really sure about it. That is the kind of people you want to order from because they know what they're doing. They're also usually passionate about their work. So if you email them and you're like, help, like this thing happened, they're a lot nicer and a lot more likely to get back to you and give you good advice because this is their whole career, their whole lives. It's just trees. So these are some of the ones that I've ordered from previously. If you'd like a longer list, we have this list of recommended nurseries on our website under the resources page. The Unity Gardens website is just theunitygardens.org. Yeah, the only one, Stark Bros usually has a lot of things at a higher price. They are one of the ones that I would say is maybe less likely to know all of the ins and outs of the things that they're selling. If you are in Indiana, definitely check out Indiana Berry first. They don't have a lot of fruit trees, but they have a ton of edible perennials and brambles and bushes. And then they also have pawpaws and like hardy figs and kiwis. Like very cool, but very local grower, really know what they're doing. So if you are in the area, they would be my top recommendation as your first stop. Also, we are going to talk briefly about mapping orchards because I believe this is a very helpful part of the problem. And the main reason that I think you should map your orchard is that you know what's there in future years. Your trees are probably going to come with a little nursery tag, which is really lovely for year one. But by year two, it's probably not going to be there anymore because it's been out in the weather. So if you would like to still know what the cultivar is, what the rootstock is, when you planted it, it's really helpful to have some kind of record that is not susceptible to wind and rain and snow. It also is really helpful to pre-measure the area that you're planting so that you can space out your trees properly. We have a spacing resource as well on our website of how far apart things should be planted. What I like to do is go to Google Earth. I take an overlay of the area that we're planting in because it's got a nice measuring tool, and then I can map it out with fun circles of different colors. And then you can see in this part I have my key of like, okay, this red one is a Carmen Jewel bush cherry, and I know that this was planted in 23. So now I know exactly what that is. So in 10 years, if this tree has died, this is especially important if you only have 2 types of apple trees, because you need to make sure that one is a different variety from the other and that they can be cross-pollinated. So if one of my apple trees dies, I want to make sure that I can check the variety of the one that's still alive and what the one is that died and replace it accordingly. If you don't want to use Google Earth, because that maybe is like overkill, you can always map it out on grid paper. You can just write it down in a notebook. Just make sure that you put it down somewhere so that you know what you have in your yard. This is also helpful because a lot of people inherit fruit trees. And so if you are passing down your house to someone else, it's very helpful to be able to tell them, like, yeah, this is this variety of tree, this is when I planted it, you know, this is how I've taken care of it, so that it keeps producing for years to come. Now we will be talking about when you should plant your fruit. So in most of the temperate US, you've got 2 planting seasons, and that's your spring and fall. So spring is in Indiana like March to May. That's usually when you're getting bare root trees, and then fall would be October, November. Depending on where you are, it's about equitable. Fall is maybe better in some places because it immediately gets snow, and so it stays watered through that first period. And then the tree is already in dormancy, it goes straight into dormancy, so it can spend that first part of being in its new home just recovering. They should always be planted when they're in dormancy, otherwise they go through more transplant shock. And if you're not sure what that means, here is a chart that shows the stages of dormancy versus not dormancy. So here in this first picture, you can see this tree is fully dormant, all the buds are closed, there's going to be no color on this tree, it's going to look really boring. This second picture is where it's starting to break dormancy. So if you got your trees looking like this, you waited a little bit too long, now they look like this is your like red flag, get it in the ground now. And then this is called bud swell, when it starts getting a little bigger. And then they will start breaking and they will start flowering, and then they will put out leaves. So this stage, fully past dormancy. This stage, also fully past dormancy. So you want to plant your trees when they look like this. If you are planning ahead and you would like to prep your site beforehand, so that you give your fruit tree a good chance of success, you can prep the site the season beforehand. And the way that we like to do this, because we don't do tilling in our farm, is we just lay down cardboard to kill the grass and layer organic material on top. And what that's going to do is going to prep the soil, it's going to activate the fungal activity in the soil. You're going to remove those weeds that would compete with your baby tree for nutrients. And then as that cardboard breaks down, as that other organic material breaks down, it'll feed the soil underneath it. Another thing that you can do is use cover crops. So instead of just covering the soil and letting the things there die out and break down, you can plant something else that you intend on pulling out or working into the soil. And that will also add some nutrients or outcompete the weeds. But if you like to prep your site beforehand, that usually does give your tree a good head start. So like we talked about in some of the previous videos, most fruit trees are grafted. And that is so that you don't get a giant full-size tree that's 50 feet tall, really hard to take care of, really hard to harvest. And when those trees are grafted, we have the scion, so the clone of the tree that we liked, attached to a rootstock. And this area where those scion and rootstock are joined is called the graft union. And it usually looks really bumpy and weird. So it's pretty easy to tell on your tree. But trees never heal their wounds fully, they just seal over them. And so anywhere that a tree has sealed over is going to be a little bit more vulnerable than the rest of the tree. So you want to make sure that that graft region is always out of the soil so that it doesn't rot and kill your tree. So here you can see this one's a little bit too close to the soil, this is out of the soil. The other thing you want to identify when you're planting is the root flare. And that is where the trunk starts to widen out at the base, and then you can see the roots coming off of it. So you don't want to plant your soil line here, even though that may look cute. You've buried the root flare, and so you've buried all of this bark, which needs oxygen to breathe and shouldn't be moist all the time. So if you put this bark under the soil level, it'll start to rot, and eventually that does kill your tree. So make sure that you're planting it at the right depth. If you've planted something and you're like, oh my God, I didn't know this, you can do surgery. So here you can see that this tree has been mulched very aggressively and that the root flare is not visible. And so what they've done is they've pulled back all of that dirt, all of that mulch, so you can see where the trunk starts to widen out at the base, and now we have a very much happier, much healthier tree with the root flare visible. And now when you go out to plant, here are some general rules you should follow. Common mistake would be to dig too small of a hole. You want to dig your hole to comfortably fit your new tree. So usually about like 2 times the size of that root ball is the size of the hole you want to dig. And that's partially so that you're not cramping up any of the roots. You want to make sure that they all fit nicely. And that's also partially to give it kind of a fighting chance of breaking through the soil, especially if you've really compacted soil, if it's just a lawn that people walk on all the time, if you've never driven heavy machinery over it and packed it down, these baby roots might need a little help to get through that compacted soil. So if you break up that soil to make those first inches of growth a little easier, that really helps the tree. Make sure that graft union is above the soil level and that your root flare is present and visible. And you should be making your hole the shape of a bowl rather than a V like this, because that usually, although that is what's easier to dig when you're digging with the traditional shovel out in the fields, that will limit your root growth. It's also important to make sure that your tree is straight at planting time. I feel like that one's pretty straightforward, but you do want to make sure that as you pat down the dirt around the tree is still standing straight. If not, straighten it out. I don't typically stake my trees. It's an additional thing to buy, it's additional equipment, and often you don't need to unless you're planting much bigger trees. Where you would stake your tree is if in a year you come back out and check and for whatever reason, maybe a windstorm, maybe it just like shifted after planting. If it's growing in the wrong direction, you can stake to correct. And be careful with it, be gentle with it. You don't want to stake and have the stake dig into the bark where it's cutting off the flow of nutrients up and down the trunk. Another thing you don't want to do, you don't want to backfill with compost. That can be like an easy thing to do because you're immediately giving it so many nutrients. But what that happens then is the roots find the compost and they don't want to go anywhere else because you've given this really nutrient-rich, dense soil directly next to their roots, and so they have no reason to continue seeking out water or nutrients in another part of the land. So you want to backfill with the original dirt that came out of the hole. If you have really, really sandy soil, you can mix that in with some compost to kind of improve the water retention capacity, but I would mostly backfill with the original soil. If you would like to do any amending to the soil at planting time, it's always best to amend with the knowledge of what your soil health looks like. So you can always do soil tests beforehand to see what is needed. A lot of orchardists are talking now about the importance of minerals in growing fruit trees. So you can add something like azomite or rock dust to add minerals if that's not something that's present in your soil. You could also do a mycorrhiza dip, and that helps kickstart that symbiotic relationship between the roots and the fungi in the soil so that it's able to access more nutrients and water. And then you want to pat the soil down to get rid of the air bubbles. And then really important, you want to water it immediately. So at least 5 gallons. So you can grab a 5-gallon bucket or just hold your hose there for a second. If you don't water, it's a lot more likely to be shocked after transplanting. Last step would be to mulch your tree. Mulching can be a very controversial topic in the arborist community because so many landscaping companies love to do what's called volcano mulching and just pile all of this mulch around your tree. But what that does, like we've talked about, is that covers the root flare, that covers the graft region, and it can really hurt your tree in the long run. So what you want to do instead is this donut shape around the base of your tree that does not cover the root flare. And mulch is really helpful for a number of reasons. It's a great weed barrier. You don't want the grass growing and competing with your tree. It is better at retaining water in the soil. So if you don't have that soil covered, it's much easier for water to evaporate out of it. So when you have mulch, you need to water less. It's great insulation for the root zone in the winter. It is also a habitat for beneficial insects. As it breaks down, it feeds the soil. And it also lets people know something's there. So when you first plant a tree, it may just look like a tiny stick. And when you put that mulching around it, people are like, oh, maybe that tiny stick is important. So that can add some protection from weed whackers and mowers. The other thing you can do, especially if you have deer or if you have a very zealous mower, is to add a tree cage around your tree planting so that it's protected from the deer and the lawnmower.